The little church sat at the edge of town, its steeple rising like a crooked finger into the gray sky. The bell had rung earlier that morning, calling everyone to gather, and now the pews were full of townsfolk in their Sunday best, whispering behind gloved hands and looking toward the altar where Clara stood. She was pale, her face drawn tight with fear, her hands clutched together so hard her knuckles were white. The lace of her plain dress itched at her collarbone, but she dared not move. Every breath felt borrowed, every moment a sentence being carried out. Her father, shoulders hunched from years of hard labor and debts he could never pay, stood off to the side, his hat clutched nervously in his hands. He couldn't meet her eyes. Clara's mother sat near the front, her thin frame trembling, hands twisting in her lap. The older woman's gaze stayed fixed on the floorboards, as if to look up and see her daughter's anguish would break her completely. This was not a wedding filled with joy or laughter. It was a transaction, a bargain to save what little the family had left. Beside Clara stood William Hartley, the man she was to marry. His beard was trimmed neatly, white with streaks of silver. His hair, though thinning, was combed with care, and his clothes were finer than any man in the county could afford. A dark suit, a pressed shirt, boots polished until they gleamed. He was 60, if not older, and while his shoulders were still broad, his frame carried the heaviness of time. Clara could smell the faint scent of tobacco clinging to his coat. He wasn't cruel-looking, no scowl, no gloating smile. Instead, his pale blue eyes regarded her with a quiet intensity she didn't know how to interpret. The preacher's voice droned on, reciting the vows as if this were no different from any other ceremony he had overseen. But to Clara, each word struck her like a hammer. She tried to focus on the wooden cross above the altar, on the candles flickering in their brass holders, on anything but the faces in the crowd staring at her, measuring her, whispering about her. She could almost hear them, so young, so poor, at least she'll never go hungry now. When the preacher asked if William would take Clara as his wife, William's voice came steady, deep, and clear, "I do." Then came her turn. The church seemed to hold its breath. Clara felt her throat tighten, the words lodged there like stones. Every instinct screamed at her to run down the aisle, to burst through the doors into the open air, to escape. But she thought of her father's failing farm, of her siblings with hollow cheeks, of the endless debts piling on their table. Her lips parted, and though it came out no louder than a whisper, it sealed her fate, "I do." The preacher smiled faintly, content with the union, and instructed William to place the ring on Clara's finger. The band was heavy, far too large for her slender hand. It slipped on easily, but it felt like iron, a shackle she would never remove. William's touch was careful, almost hesitant, as he slid it onto her hand. Then, before the congregation, he leaned forward and pressed the briefest kiss against her cheek. His beard scratched her skin, and she shivered, not from cruelty, but from the strange finality of it all. Polite applause followed, though it sounded hollow, even mocking, in Clara's ears. Some faces looked sympathetic, others envious. A few even smiled, as if this marriage was a victory for her, not a loss. To them, she was lucky to have been chosen by a man of means. But to Clara, it felt like the earth had swallowed her whole. Afterward, the small gathering moved to the reception hall beside the church. The tables were set with bread, cheese, and roasted chicken, but Clara could not eat. She sat stiffly at the head table, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the food until it blurred before her eyes. William sat beside her, making small efforts at conversation. He asked her about her school lessons, about the books she liked, whether she enjoyed riding horses. Clara answered in short, clipped phrases, her voice trembling too much to say more. He didn't push her. He simply nodded, filling the silence with his steady presence. When it came time to leave, the wagon that would take her to his ranch felt like a hearse. The townsfolk lined the road, waving and offering blessings as if this were some fairy tale ending. Clara sat in silence, her small traveling trunk at her feet, her gaze fixed on the horizon as the wheels clattered over the dirt road. The ranch loomed in the distance, larger than she had imagined, with sprawling fields and sturdy fences. It was wealth, yes, but it was also foreign, frightening. William led her inside the ranch house. The air smelled faintly of cedar, smoke, and polish. The parlor was filled with shelves of books, a fireplace crackling warmly, curtains drawn neatly at the windows. It was the house of a man who lived alone but kept order. Clara's eyes darted nervously over the space, searching for some clue of what was to come. He carried her trunk upstairs and set it gently at the foot of a large bed covered in a quilt of deep blues and reds. Clara's breath hitched as she stepped into the room. The bed felt enormous, looming like a storm cloud over her. She froze at the threshold, her body stiff, her heart racing. William turned to her, his face serious but not unkind. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight as if he, too, felt the awkwardness pressing in around them. "Clara," he said at last, his voice deep but quiet. "I know this isn't what you wanted. I know you didn't choose me. But I made a promise, to provide for you, to give you safety. I won't take what isn't freely given. This room is yours, until you're ready, if you ever are." Her eyes widened at his words. She had braced herself for demands, for orders, for the weight of him pressing down on her before the night was over. But instead, he stepped aside, gave her a small nod, almost like a bow, and left the room, closing the door gently behind him. Clara stood there, frozen, the silence pressing heavy. Slowly, she walked to the bed and sank down on its edge, the quilt soft beneath her hands. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. For the first time all day, she wasn't fighting tears or choking back panic. She was confused, yes, and wary. But beneath all that was the faintest flicker of something she hadn't expected at all. Relief. That night, as the fire crackled downstairs and the wind rustled the trees outside, Clara lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Her body was tense, but her mind kept circling back to William's words. "Until you're ready, if you ever are." She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for now, she let her eyes close, her fists unclench, and for the first time since the bells rang that morning, she allowed herself to breathe. The first week passed in a blur of silence. Clara stayed mostly inside the ranch house, too timid to wander far, while William went about his work in the fields and barns. Each morning, she heard his boots on the porch before dawn, the creak of the barn door opening, and the distant whinny of horses. When she finally crept down the stairs, there was always a loaf of bread left on the table, sometimes still warm, alongside a note in his firm, tidy handwriting, "Eat well. The day is yours." At first, she mistrusted this kindness. She waited for the moment when it would be stripped away, when the demands would begin. But day after day, William kept his distance. He treated her, not as a prize or a possession, but as something fragile, like a bird perched just barely within reach. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and yet it gave her space to breathe. Clara filled her time with small things. She dusted the shelves, ran her fingers along the spines of William's books, and stared out the window at the endless sweep of land stretching under the sky. The silence gnawed at her, but it also gave her time to think. She remembered her father's weary eyes when he had told her this marriage was the only way to save their home. She remembered her mother's trembling hands. She remembered the ring sliding onto her finger, heavier than any burden she had carried before. And then, one morning, she dared to step outside. The air smelled of sun-warmed hay and earth. Chickens scratched in the yard, and beyond the fences, cattle grazed lazily. She saw William at a distance, mending a section of fence, his broad back bent to the task. She thought of retreating back inside, but then he noticed her and straightened. He didn't call out, didn't wave her over, only gave a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to his work. It was the first time she realized how much he was trying not to scare her. That afternoon, curiosity tugged her to the barn. She pushed the door open quietly, the scent of leather and horse filling her lungs. William sat on a stool, carefully repairing a saddle. He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Would you like to learn?" he asked, holding up the needle and leather strap. His tone carried no expectation, no pressure. Clara hesitated, then gave a small nod. He guided her hands with patience, showing her how to pull the thread tight and knot it without tearing the leather. His hands were rough and strong, yet his touch was cautious, always giving her space to pull away if she wished. By the time the sun dipped low, she had managed a few clumsy stitches. William smiled faintly, and it was the first time she saw him look almost boyish. "Not bad," he said. "Not bad at all." Something loosened in her chest, though she didn't understand it then. As days turned into weeks, she began to see him differently. He was old, yes, but his strength was undeniable. He rose before the sun, carried bales of hay with ease, and worked alongside his ranch hands rather than commanding them from afar. She noticed how he always saw to it that his men ate first, how he paid them fairly, how he gave a sack of flour to a struggling family without asking for a coin in return. Respect seemed to follow him wherever he went, though he never demanded it. But beyond the ranch, whispers followed Clara. When she went to town for supplies, she heard the townsfolk muttering behind her back. "Poor girl, sold like cattle," some said. Others sneered, "She knows what she's doing, catching a rich man's purse like that." The words stung, burning like nettles under her skin. She would return home with her head bowed, clutching her basket tightly, and say nothing. One day, the mutters grew louder. As Clara stood at the market stall, a woman near her whispered to another, too loudly for it to be accidental, 17, and already she's betting a man old enough to be her grandfather. Shameless. Clara froze, shame and rage twisting inside her. Before she could move, William appeared at her side. He had been standing a few feet away, paying for feed, and now his tall frame cast a long shadow over the two women. "She is my wife," William said, his voice calm but iron hard. "And you will speak of her with respect. If you've something to say, say it to me." The women shrank back, their faces flushed, and muttered apologies. Clara stood speechless, her heart pounding. On the ride home, she expected William to scold her for letting their business become public gossip. But instead, he said only, "People will always talk. Let them. Their words don't change who you are." That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Clara found herself watching him more closely. The lines on his face told stories of hardship, but there was no bitterness in them. His hands, though rough, moved gently when he set a cup of tea before her. He didn't ask her to thank him, didn't demand she sit closer. He only sat across from her, reading quietly, his presence steady and grounding. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like a captive in his home. She felt safe. The turning point came on a stormy night. The sky split open with lightning, and rain pounded the ranch with fury. From her window, Clara saw the barn roof shaking, the horses inside kicking wildly. Before she could think, William was out the door, running into the storm. Without hesitation, she followed, her dress clinging to her as the rain soaked her through. Together, they worked side by side, dragging sacks to weigh down the beams, calming the terrified animals, tying down what they could before the wind tore it away. Her hands blistered, her hair plastered to her face, but she didn't stop. William barked directions, but not with anger, with trust, as though he knew she could handle it. When the storm finally passed, the two of them stood in the muddy yard, gasping for breath, soaked to the bone. Clara looked at him then, his beard dripping with rain, his clothes plastered to his skin, and she laughed. A real, unrestrained laugh, bubbling out of her chest as she shook her head at their sorry state. William chuckled too, deep and rumbling, and for the first time, the space between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge. In that moment, something shifted. He was no longer only the man her father had chosen for her, nor the stranger who had placed a heavy ring on her finger. He was her partner in the storm, and in the warmth of his eyes, she saw not pity or possession, but pride. The marriage had begun as a cage, but as days became weeks, Clara realized the truth no one had expected, not her father, not the gossips, not even herself. What bound them was no longer just a bargain. It was respect, and trust, and something softer beginning to take root in the quiet spaces of their lives. Something that, in time, could grow into love.